I heard the branches first, lifting and settling, as though a great weight moved from tree to tree above us, though the night air in Hubei lay still and wet as cloth. The mules shuddered, eyes rolling white, and somewhere in the dark, a low, almost human cough answered our own held breath. When I raised my lantern, the beam caught a handprint on the bark, far higher than any man could reach. Men have pressed me, in clubs' smoking rooms, and over letters gone yellow to set down what we found in those Chinese hills. I do so now, though I question my own prudence. If you are inclined to such accounts, favour this one with your attention, lend it your judgment, and when you have heard it, tell me which road you would have taken and whether you would have turned back sooner than we did. To understand that handprint, I must return to the spring of 1934 and to the city of Yichang on the Yangtze, where the river narrows and the hills of western Hubei begin to rise like dark green walls against the sky. I was then 32 years of age, a junior zoologist attached to the Royal Asiatic Society, sent to accompany a Sino-British survey into the Shennongjia forests. Officially, our purpose concerned watershed mapping and the cataloguing of endemic species. Unofficially, there was a quieter curiosity, passed in murmurs between professors and officials, persistent reports from those mountains of a Wildman, a great ape-like creature the locals named Yeren, the wild person. Our small party left Yichang on the 17th of April. There was Major Edward Henderson, late of the Indian Army, ostensibly in charge of logistics and security. Dr. Arthur Llewellyn, a Welsh botanist with a scholar's stoop and an endless patience for ferns, and myself, tasked with specimen collection and the keeping of a formal record. We were joined in Yichang by two Chinese gentlemen, Professor Jiang Wei of Wuhan University, whose English surpassed my own in precision, and a younger man named Li Jun, a local school teacher engaged as interpreter and guide. We travelled with 4 muleteers and 6 pack animals, carrying canvas tents, a theodolite, barometer, field microscopes, specimen jars, a hand-cranked wireless set that seldom found a signal, and 3 Lee Enfield rifles with 24 rounds apiece. The weather that week held clear and temperate, the river a broad band of pewter under a pale sky. On the 3rd day, as the last river junks fell behind and the path began to climb in earnest, I first heard the name Yeren spoken without amusement. We had stopped at a small village, little more than a string of mud-walled houses clinging to a slope above a terraced field. Smoke drifted from low chimneys and chickens scratched in the dust. While Henderson bargained for eggs, I sat on a low stone with Li Jun, sharing his cigarettes and watching a boy drive a pig along the path with a willow switch. Li cupped his match against the breeze. "My grandfather used to tell us stories of these mountains," he said. "When the mist comes down," he said, "the hills stand on their toes to listen." "That is a poet's fancy," I answered, smiling. "Did he speak also of wild men?" Li hesitated, the match burning low between his fingers. "Yes, the Yeren, hair all over the body, like a bear but walking as a man. They say it steals corn and pigs. It takes women sometimes." He gave a small shrug. "Old men's talk. You do not credit it yourself?" He drew on the cigarette, exhaled slowly. "I have not seen such a thing. But in winter, when the snow lies even, there are sometimes tracks on the high paths. Too large for a man, too straight for a bear. The hunters speak of them quietly." "Some unknown primate, perhaps," I said. "These forests are scarcely touched. New species are found every year." Li smiled, though his eyes remained on the hills. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the mountains keep some things for themselves. It was a small exchange, unremarkable at the time, but I have returned to it often. There was no fear in his voice then, only a thoughtful reserve. Had I understood the weight of that reserve, I might have asked more questions. We left the last rice fields behind 2 days later. The path narrowed, climbing into mixed broadleaf and coniferous forest, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. The mule's hooves clopped on stones slick with moss. Somewhere above us, unseen, water fell in thin veils from the cliffs, its sound mingling with the calls of unseen birds. The first anomaly came on the 6th day, and I laughed at it. We had camped in a narrow valley where a stream braided itself through boulders the color of old bone. The air held the coolness of snowmelt. That evening, as the light filtered green through overlapping leaves, I walked a little way from camp to relieve myself and to stretch my legs. The forest here was dense, trunks rising straight and tall, their crowns knitting together to form a high, shifting ceiling. I noticed the silence first. It was not the complete absence of sound one finds on a windless winter plain, but rather the sudden cessation of a particular layer of noise. The cicadas, which had rasped incessantly all afternoon, were quiet. The birds that had chattered in the canopy had fallen still. Only the stream, some yards away, continued its murmuring. I stood with my hand on a trunk, listening. The hairs on my forearm prickled, though the air was not cold. For no reason I could name, I felt watched. Then, from somewhere upslope, came a short, guttural call. It was not unlike the bark of a deer, but deeper, with a curious rising cadence at the end, almost interrogative. It sounded once, twice, then fell silent. I waited, heart beating faster than the sound warranted. When nothing further followed, I shook myself, annoyed by my own nerves. There are many unfamiliar calls in any foreign forest. I returned to camp, saying nothing. That night, as we sat around a small fire and Henderson told a story of a tiger he had shot in Assam, I heard the cicadas resume their rasping, as though some unseen hand had lifted. The next days passed in hard but ordinary labor. We rose at dawn, ate rice and dried fish, broke camp, and followed the mules along faint tracks that wound between towering trunks and over ridges slick with fallen needles. The air grew thinner, cooler. Professor Zhang paused frequently to note tree species, pressing leaves between pages. I collected beetles and small lizards, pinning and labeling them with the tidy satisfaction of a man engaged in his proper work. In the evenings, when the tents stood and the mules were hobbled, there were small moments of human warmth. On the 9th night, rain drummed on the canvas overhead, and we all crowded under the largest tent, the air close with damp wool and tobacco smoke. Henderson produced a flask of brandy, and we passed it around. "Once this is done," he said, leaning back on his elbows, "I intend to return to Surrey and plant roses until they put me in the ground. No more leeches, no more cursed humidity. A little garden, a decent claret, that will do." Dr. Llewellyn smiled in his shy way. "I should be content with a small glass house," he said, "to cultivate orchids without worrying that some colonel will requisition my specimens for his drawing room." "And you, Mr. Harrington," Zhang asked me, "what waits for you in England?" I hesitated, thinking of the grey house in Kent where my widowed mother kept the curtains perpetually half-drawn, the smell of coal dust, the stacks of journals on my desk. "I should like to lecture," I said at last. "To have a room of my own, shelves of specimens, a blackboard, to make some small contribution to what is known." Lee, who had been listening quietly, spoke then. "I would like to build a school in my village," he said, "with proper books, so that the children there may know that the world is larger than these hills, and that the stories of old men are not the only stories." We sat for a moment in the soft drumming of the rain. "Still," Henderson said, lifting the flask again, "I should not object if we were to find some wild man to bring back. Imagine the newspapers. British and Chinese scholars capture forest ape. They would name the creature after you, Harrington. Simia Harrington II. You would have your room." We laughed then, all of us, even Lee. It was an easy laughter, the kind that comes when men are tired and the rain is outside and the world seems knowable. It did not last. The second anomaly was more tangible. On the 12th day, we reached a high saddle between two ridges, the forest opening briefly to show us a glimpse of distant blue-grey peaks, layered one behind the other, fading into haze. Snow still clung in streaks to the highest slopes. The wind here carried a clean, cold edge. We stopped to rest the mules. While the others smoked, I walked along the crest, scanning for animal sign. There was a patch of bare earth where the wind had stripped away the litter. Across it ran a line of impressions, half melted at the edges, but still distinct. They were tracks, that much was clear. 5-toed, plantigrade, with a broad heel and a pronounced ball. At first glance, I took them for the prints of a man in soft shoes, but their size gave me pause. Each measured nearly 14 inches from heel to toe, and the stride between them was extraordinary, near 4 feet from one to the next. They ran straight across the saddle and vanished where the ground turned to rock. I knelt, placing my own boot beside one. My foot, in its stout leather, looked small and clumsy. "Henderson," I called, "come and look at this." He joined me, squinting down. "Some peasant with big feet," he said at once, but there was no conviction in his tone. "Barefoot at this altitude in April?" I shook my head. "There are no villages within 2 days' march." Professor Zhang crouched beside us, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He traced one print lightly with a gloved finger, careful not to disturb it. "These are not bear," he said quietly, "nor any monkey I know." Lee stood a little apart, arms folded. "Yeren," he said. I looked up sharply. "You think so?" He did not answer, but his gaze on the distant peaks was troubled. We argued in the manner of educated men, each clinging to his discipline. Henderson suggested a hunter wearing some form of padded footwear. I counted that there were no drag marks, no signs of a staff. Llewellyn proposed an unknown species of bear, though he admitted the gait was wrong. Zhang said little, but I saw him measure the stride with his eyes, lips pressed thin. In the end, we recorded the tracks, sketched them, and took photographs with my folding Kodak, the glass plates carefully wrapped. It was a curiosity, a puzzle to be solved later in the comfort of an office. We moved on. Had the anomalies ended there, I might have forgotten them, dismissed them as I wished to do. They did not. The forest grew stranger as we pressed deeper into Shennongjia. The trees here were older, their trunks gnarled and moss-hung, roots coiling over rocks like the limbs of some buried titan. Mist lay often in the hollows, even at midday, clinging to the ground in pale, shifting sheets. The sun became a diffused presence, its position hard to judge. On the 15th day, we lost one of the mules. We had been following a narrow ledge above a ravine, the path scarcely wide enough for 2 men abreast, when the animal at the rear began to balk. Its ears flattened, eyes rolling, it planted its hooves and refused to move. The muleteer cursed, tugging at the rope. The air around us felt suddenly close, though a chill wind slid down the ravine. "Leave it a moment," Henderson called back. "They take fancies." The mule's breath came in harsh snorts. Then, with a violent jerk, it swung its head towards the trees above the path, nostrils flaring, and let out a braying scream unlike any sound I had heard from such a beast. It reared, striking at the air, and before the man at its halter could leap clear, it had twisted, the pack shifting, and gone over the edge. We heard the crash of its fall through branches, then a dull, final thud somewhere far below. By the time we scrambled back along the ledge to look down, there was only the white churn of mist and the tops of trees. No movement. No further sound. The muleteer, a wiry man with a scar down one cheek, made a sign I did not recognize, touching his fingers to his brow and then to the ground. He spoke rapidly to Lee, who listened, face pale. "What does he say?" I asked. Lee hesitated. "He says something was watching from the trees," he answered at last. "He says he felt its eyes." "Superstition," Henderson said sharply, but I saw him glance up at the branches all the same. That night, the men built the fire higher than usual, and the muleteers tethered the remaining animals close, their ropes short. The forest beyond the circle of light seemed to press in, the trunks like ranks of silent onlookers. We began to hear the calls more frequently. They came at odd hours, just before dawn, when the world is at its thinnest. In the blue light of evening, when smoke from the fire hung low. Always the same curious mixture of familiarity and wrongness. Sometimes a long, low hoot rising at the end. Sometimes a series of short, harsh barks, like a stag's butt, deeper, with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Once, 2 nights after the mule's fall, we heard an answering call from another slope, as if 2 unseen throats conversed across the valley. The pattern of their exchange had a rhythm to it, a spacing not unlike speech. We spoke then of gibbons, of langurs, of the known apes of Asia. Yet none of us could name a species that matched these sounds in that place, at that altitude. The forest's ordinary noises began to seem like a veil drawn over some other, more deliberate listening. It was around this time, at perhaps the 40th mile from the last village, that the weather turned. A wet, clinging fog descended, not the light mist we had seen in hollows, but a dense, cold shroud that reduced the world to a circle of 20 yards. Our compasses wavered, the needle quivering uncertainly, and the sun became a pale disk, its position ambiguous. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, a faint musk, animal yet not quite like any beast I knew. It came and went as if borne on a breath. We moved slowly, the mule's packs brushing against trunks that loomed suddenly out of the white. Drips fell from unseen branches, pattering on our hats. The fog muffled sound, so that when a branch snapped somewhere off to the right, it seemed at once near and far. It was on the 19th day that the forest answered us directly. We had made camp in a small clearing, little more than a widening of the path where a great tree had once stood, its stump now moss-covered. The fog had thickened at dusk, so that the fire's light became a mere orange blur. We ate in a close circle, the damp seeping into our clothes. The mules shifted restlessly, their outlines ghostly beyond the flames. "Sing something, Lee," Henderson said, perhaps to cut the oppressive quiet. A song from your village. Lee smiled faintly and obliged, his voice soft but clear, rising in a tune that seemed to move like water over stones. The words were in a dialect I did not know, but the melody held a melancholy sweetness. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then, from somewhere in the white, came the same melody, hummed in a low, rough voice. It was out of tune, the notes slightly flattened. But the shape of the song was unmistakable. It went on for perhaps 10 seconds, faltered, then stopped. No one moved. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "Who is there?" Henderson called, his hand going to the rifle beside him. "Come forward." There was no answer, only the soft hiss of the fire and the thick, pressing fog. One of the muleteers muttered something, his voice shaking. Lee's face had gone very white. "It is some man in the forest," I said, though my own voice sounded thin to my ears. "A hunter. He heard your song and repeats it." "In this fog?" Zhang murmured, "without a light?" We sat awake long into the night, listening. No further sound came, save once, just before dawn, a single low chuckle, like a cough smothered in a great chest. From that point, my rational explanations began to fray. We found more sign. A stand of young bamboo, several stalks snapped off 6 feet above the ground, the breaks fresh and green, as though something tall and strong had passed through carelessly. A patch of bare earth where something had lain, pressed down in a shape roughly man-sized but broader, the impression of hair left in the damp soil like the trace of coarse fabric. Stones moved from where we had left them, small cairns toppled in the night. Once, returning to camp after a short surveying excursion with Henderson, we found our food crates disturbed. The lashings had been untied, not cut or broken. Dried fish and rice had been taken, but tins of bully beef left untouched. The muleteers swore they had seen no one. "Monkeys," Henderson said, but there was a furrow between his brows. "They are clever with knots. Monkeys do not take rice and leave meat," Zhang observed quietly. The fog persisted, lifting only fitfully. Our progress slowed to a crawl. Tempers frayed. Henderson grew curt, snapping at the muleteers for small slownesses. Llewellyn retreated into himself, speaking only when spoken to, his eyes shadowed. Lee began to carry his own small rifle everywhere, even to relieve himself, the barrel wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp. I found myself waking in the small hours, heart pounding, certain that something had just moved beyond the thin canvas of my tent. Once I smelled that musk strongly, a hot animal tang, and heard the faintest sound of breathing, as of a great bellows somewhere just beyond the wall. When I thrust my head out, lantern in hand, there was nothing but the grey press of fog and the dim shapes of trees. At the 45th mile by our reckoning, we reached a high basin ringed by slopes thick with spruce and fir. A narrow stream cut through its center, its banks churned to mud by the passage of many hooves. It was here that the muleteers refused to go further. They gathered at dawn, their packs already half-loaded, and spoke in low tones with Lee. I watched from the fire, sipping bitter tea, the cold biting at my fingers. At last, Lee came to us, his expression grave. "They say this is the edge," he said. "Beyond this basin, the Yeren country begins. They will not take the animals further. They say we have already angered the spirits by coming so far." Henderson's jaw clenched. "Nonsense. Tell them we pay double." Lee shook his head. "It is not a matter of money. One man says his cousin went beyond the ridge and did not return. They found his hat in a tree, very high up. They say the wild men carry off those who trespass. There is no such creature, Henderson snapped. Tell them so. Lee looked at him steadily. Do you still believe that, Major? It was the first open challenge I had heard him make. We argued for an hour. In the end, we compromised. The muleteers would remain in the basin with the animals and our heavier equipment, while we 4 Europeans, with Lee and Professor Jiang, would make a lighter foray of 2 days beyond the ridge, carrying our own packs to take readings and perhaps collect further evidence. I recall now the relief I felt at the thought of going on. The idea of being turned back by superstition stung my pride more than any fear. We left the basin under a sky of uniform grey, climbing a narrow, stony path that wound between dark trunks. The air grew colder, the fog thinning, but not lifting entirely. Patches of old snow lingered in shaded gullies. The forest here felt older still, as though it had watched many things come and go. It was on that ascent that we came upon the mark. The tree was a great fir, its trunk as wide as 3 men could encircle with their arms. Across its bark, at a height of perhaps 8 feet, ran a series of deep, parallel grooves, each the width of a man's finger and as long as my hand. The bark hung in ragged strips, sap bleeding in slow amber tears. I reached up, standing on the tips of my boots, and could just brush the lowest of the marks with my fingertips. Bear, Henderson said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. They claw trees to mark their territory. Bears do not stand 8 feet high at the shoulder, Jiang replied, and these grooves are too straight, too even. Look at the spacing. He was right. The marks were curiously regular, as though made by something with 5 long parallel appendages. Lee knelt, examining the ground. There are tracks, he said, pointing. In the thin layer of damp needles, impressions showed faintly, the same broad 5-toed prints we had seen on the saddle, though these were fresher, the edges crisp. We followed them for some yards, hearts in our throats, until they vanished abruptly on a patch of bare rock. There was no sign of where the maker had gone, no scuff on the stone, no broken twig. An ape could climb, I said, more to myself than to the others. It could have taken to the trees. Then why no broken branches? Llewellyn murmured. We stood in the stillness, each man listening to the beat of his own heart. By then, my earlier skepticism had thinned to a brittle shell. I still reached for names, for categories, but they slipped from my grasp like wet stones. The forest did not care for my need to classify. We made camp that night on a narrow shelf above a steep slope, the ground uneven with roots. The fog had thinned to ragged skeins, revealing a sky of low racing clouds. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset. We drew the tents close, the fire struggling against a wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was perhaps an hour after midnight when the forest ceased to breathe. I woke without knowing why, my mouth dry, the canvas above me pale with moonlight. It took me a moment to identify what was wrong. The wind had stopped. The trees, which had creaked and whispered all evening, were motionless. Even the small sounds of settling earth, of distant water, had fallen silent. I lay very still, my ears straining. The air in the tent felt heavy, as though something pressed down upon it. Then, from just beyond the thin wall, came the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crushing small branches with a muted crackle. Not the light, quick tread of a deer, nor the heavy 4-beat of a bear, but a measured 2-beat pace, as of a man walking upright. The ground seemed to tremble faintly with each step. The footsteps passed my tent, paused, then moved on. A moment later, I heard the faint creak of leather, a hitching breath. Henderson's voice sounded, low and taut. "Who is there?" There was no answer. The footsteps circled the camp, unhurried, as if the walker had all the time in the world. Once, very close to my head, I heard a soft, wet inhalation, like a great nose drawing in our scent. The hair on my arms and neck rose. I found that I had wrapped my fingers around the butt of the revolver under my blanket without conscious thought. From Lee's tent came a whispered word in Chinese, a prayer or a curse, I could not tell. The footsteps ceased as abruptly as they had begun. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, far up the slope, a single, low call sounded, a drawn-out hoot that rose at the end into something almost like a question. Another answered, further off, its tone slightly different, a shade higher. They spoke thus, back and forth, for perhaps a minute. Then silence returned, deep and complete. We did not sleep again that night. At dawn, we found prints all around the camp, some as close as 3 feet from the tents. In the grey light, they looked almost ordinary, just depressions in the earth. But their size and number made my stomach turn. One had pressed into the soft ground beside my own boot print of the day before, overlapping it like a larger hand laid over a child's. Something had stood where I had stood, looked where I had looked. We did not speak much as we broke camp. There was a new economy to our movements, a quiet haste. No one suggested turning back, not yet, but our earlier eagerness had drained away, replaced by a sober, watchful caution. It was on the following day, the 20th since leaving Yichang, that we reached the hollow where I saw it. We had been descending into a shallow valley, the trees thinning to reveal an open space ahead. The fog here lay in low bands, drifting between trunks, the ground carpeted with last year's leaves. Birdsong returned fitfully, as though from a great distance. The smell reached us first, a strong animal musk, overlaid with a sour, almost human tang, like unwashed wool left damp too long. It was so sudden and so intense that I gagged. "Do you smell that?" Llewellyn whispered. We moved more slowly, rifles in hand. Henderson signaled for quiet, his jaw set. My heart thudded in my ears. The hollow opened before us, a shallow bowl perhaps 30 yards across, ringed by trees that leaned inwards, their branches forming a kind of canopy. At its center lay a rough nest of broken branches and leaves, pressed down into a broad, shallow depression. Around it, scattered bones gleamed pale, the skull and long bones of what looked to be a goat, the smaller, more delicate remains of birds. A movement at the far edge of the hollow drew my gaze. It stepped from behind a tree with a slow, unhurried motion, as though it had known we were there all along. In the years since, I have read many accounts, some florid, some vague. I will keep to what I saw. It stood upright, on 2 legs, its posture more erect than a chimpanzee's, but not quite that of a man. Its height I judged at between 7 and 8 feet, its shoulders immensely broad. The body was covered in hair of a reddish-brown hue, matted in places with mud and leaves, longer on the arms and thighs, shorter on the chest and abdomen. The musculature beneath was evident with every shift, thick forearms, barrel chest, thighs like carved wood. The head was set low between the shoulders, the neck thick and powerful. The face was the most disquieting. Not wholly ape, not wholly human. The brow ridge was pronounced, casting the deep-set eyes in shadow, yet there was a flatness to the face, a broad nose with wide flaring nostrils, and a mouth with thin, almost human lips. The jaw was heavy, the chin receding slightly. The ears were small and close to the head. Its hands hung at mid-thigh, long-fingered, the nails dark and blunt. In one, it held a length of branch, stripped of bark, as a man might hold a staff. It looked at us. In that gaze, there was no animal panic, no startle. It was measuring. The eyes were a dark, deep brown, almost black, and in them I saw a calm curiosity and something like weariness. No one spoke. I do not think any of us breathed. For a moment, the world narrowed to that exchange of gaze. The forest, the fog, the years of study and rank and flag all fell away. There was only this thing, standing where no such thing should be, looking at us as if we were the intruders we were. Then Henderson, whose training was to act, not to contemplate, raised his rifle. "Do not," I heard myself say, but my voice was small, lost in the space between us. The creature's eyes flicked to the movement of the barrel. It made a low sound then, not loud, but deep, a kind of chesty rumble that I felt more than heard. The hair on my arms stood up. Henderson's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot cracked through the hollow like lightning. Birds exploded from the surrounding trees in a flurry of wings. The smell of cordite overlay the musk. The bullet struck the tree trunk 2 feet to the creature's left, splintering bark. Henderson had missed. Whether from nerves or some last-second falter, I do not know. The creature flinched, more in surprise than in pain, and stepped back. Its lips peeled away from its teeth in a grimace that was not quite a snarl, not quite a smile. It made a sound then that I have never heard replicated, a rising, ululating cry that seemed to pass through the bones of my skull. From the trees around the hollow, other cries answered. They came from 3, perhaps 4 directions, at varying distances, overlapping. Some were deeper, some higher, but all carried the same uncanny, almost articulate quality. The air thrummed with them. The creature before us turned then with a fluid motion and moved towards the trees. It did not run in the way a man runs. Rather, it loped, its long arms swinging, its body inclining forward, covering ground with an ease that was terrible to watch. In 3 strides, it had reached the nearest trunk. Without pausing, it placed its hands against the bark and climbed, its legs pushing, arms pulling, in a smooth, practiced rhythm. Within seconds, it was 20 feet up, then 30, vanishing into the dense canopy. The cries continued for a moment, then cut off together, as if at some unheard signal. We stood in the sudden silence, the smoke from Henderson's rifle curling upwards. "God, help us," Llewellyn whispered. The immediate aftermath had a curious flatness, as if the mind, having briefly glimpsed something beyond its frame, refused to take it in. Henderson reloaded mechanically, his hands steady by long habit. "We must follow it," he said, his voice tight. "We cannot let this chance go. Do you understand what this is?" "Yes," I said quietly, "and that is precisely why we must leave." Professor Jiang nodded slowly. "We are not hunters," he said. "We are not prepared for this." Lee stood with his rifle half raised, eyes scanning the trees. His face had the peculiar pallor of a man who has just seen a familiar story step out of the firelight and into the daylight. "There were others," he said. "You heard them. We are in their place." Henderson looked from one to the other of us, incredulous. "We are the first men of science to see this creature. We have photographs, tracks, if we can bring back a specimen." "At what cost?" Llewellyn broke in, more sharply than I had ever heard him speak. "To kill one of them here, within call of its fellows, with 6 bullets between us and miles of forest in every direction. Are you mad?" For a moment I thought Henderson would strike him. His face darkened, his jaw working. Then something in his expression eased, and his shoulders sagged. "We retreat, then," he said, the words sounding as though they had been dragged from him. "Back to the basin. We regroup, we consider, but we do not speak of this to the muleteers. They are nervous enough." We left the hollow at once, but the forest did not release us easily. As we climbed back towards the ridge, the sense of being watched became almost a physical pressure. Branches shifted where no wind blew. Once, a stone the size of a man's fist fell onto the path 10 yards ahead of us, bouncing once, twice, then coming to rest. We looked up, rifles ready, but saw only the dense weave of branches. At another point, as we skirted a steep drop, a branch snapped behind us with a sound like a rifle shot. I turned in time to see a shadow withdraw behind a tree, a glimpse of reddish hair, a massive shoulder, then nothing. We did not fire. Some instinct deeper than reason told us that to do so would be to cross a line we could not uncross. The calls followed us along the ridge, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, as though a shifting cordon moved with us. They were not constant. There were stretches of silence that were somehow worse, when every creak of leather, every clink of metal seemed to shout our presence. By the time we saw the basin again, the light was failing. The fog here had lifted somewhat, revealing the ring of dark trees and the small human geometry of the muleteers' camp. Tents, a corral of rope and stakes, the faint thread of smoke from a fire. Relief loosened something in my chest. We quickened our pace. The relief did not last. As we drew nearer, a wrongness became apparent. The mules were huddled at one end of the corral, pressed together, their heads low, ears flattened. The tents sagged, one half collapsed. The fire was little more than embers. No voices sounded. "Hello," Henderson called. "Chen, Wu." There was no answer. We entered the camp with rifles raised. The ground was churned, the soft earth bearing the marks of many feet, the small familiar prints of the muleteers' boots, the sharp crescents of mule hooves, and among them, larger bear prints, crossing and recrossing. One tent had been torn open along its seam, the canvas ripped in long, parallel strips. Inside, bedding lay scattered, a cooking pot overturned. A tin plate lay in the dirt, bent nearly double, as though crumpled in a great hand. By the fire lay a hat I recognized, the battered felt of the scarred muleteer. It was crushed, its brim torn. "Blood," Lee said quietly, pointing. On one of the tent pegs, a dark smear had dried, almost black now. There were more such smears on a nearby tree trunk at a height too great for a man's shoulder. Of the men themselves, there was no sign. We searched the immediate area, calling their names until our voices grew hoarse. We found, some 50 yards into the trees, a rope snapped as if by a great strain, its end frayed. Nearby, a mule lay on its side, neck twisted at an unnatural angle, eyes bulging. There were no tooth marks, no torn flesh, only bruising along its throat, as if something had gripped and squeezed. The other mules, those still living, rolled their eyes and stamped, white foam at their mouths. Henderson's face had gone ashen. "We cannot stay," he said. "We will take what we can carry and go. Now, before dark." "Go where?" Llewellyn asked, though the answer was plain. "Back," I said. "Down, to the villages, to the river, anywhere but here." We moved with a desperate efficiency I had not thought us capable of in our fatigue. We took only what was essential: food, water, rifles, a small tent, my notebooks, and the photographic plates, though I confess I hesitated over these. The wireless set, the heavier instruments, we left. Weight had become an enemy. The remaining mules we loosed, hoping they would find their own way down. They did not move at first, as if the invisible ring around the basin held them as surely as it held us. At last, one bolted. Crashing through the undergrowth, the others following in a panic. Their passage was loud and clumsy, a stark contrast to the near-silent movements we had heard from the unseen watchers. We left the basin as the last light drained from the sky, taking a lower path than the one by which we had come, one that Lee assured us would eventually rejoin the main trail. The forest closed around us, the trunks like pillars of some vast ruined hall. That first night of our retreat is blurred in my memory, a succession of small terrors. The snap of twigs that froze us in our tracks. The sudden, overwhelming reek of musk that sent us stumbling forward, hands shaking. Once, in the small hours, a cry so close and so loud that it seemed to split the air, followed by the crashing of something large moving parallel to us in the dark. We did not build a fire. We huddled under the small tent, our breath steaming, rifles across our knees. Sleep came in snatches, broken by starts and the imagined brush of a hand against the canvas. At dawn, the forest seemed almost benign, the branches laced with weak sunlight, birds tentatively resuming their calls. It was easy then to doubt the night's impressions, to tell oneself that fear had magnified every sound. Yet the prints in the soft earth beside our camp were real, large, bare, some half overlapping our own. Our descent took 3 days. On the second, rain began, a steady, cold fall that turned the path to mud and plastered our clothes to our skin. The forest became a dripping maze, every surface slick, the air full of the constant patter of water. The calls grew less frequent, or perhaps the rain masked them. Once we crossed a small landslip where the earth had given way, exposing pale roots and stones. In the fresh mud were more prints, heading downwards as if something large had passed not long before. We spoke little. There was a tacit agreement not to mention the missing men, as if naming them would summon their fates upon us. Each man carried his own private tally of guilt and fear. On the third day, near dusk, we emerged at last from the deep forest onto a lower slope where terraced fields began again, their flooded paddies reflecting the grey sky. The sight of human geometry, of straight lines and right angles, struck me with an almost painful relief. The first village we reached received us with a wary curiosity. We must have been a strange sight. 5 mud-splattered, hollow-eyed men in foreign and scholarly garb, carrying rifles and packs, but no beasts. The headman, an elderly man with a face like dried apple peel, listened to Lee's account with grave attention, his gaze flicking often to the tree line. He asked questions I could not follow. Lee answered at length. At one point, the old man spat into the dust and made a sign with his hands, then turned to look at us with a mixture of pity and something like reproach. "What does he say?" I asked later, when we had been given a corner of a house to sleep in. Lee hesitated. "He says we were foolish to go so far," he said at last. "He says the Yeren have their own places and that men who do not respect boundaries are taken. He says we are lucky to have come back at all." We reached Yichang 10 days after leaving the basin, thinner, quieter, carrying with us a story we had not yet agreed how to tell. The return to the city had an unreal quality. The noise of the river traffic, the cries of vendors, the clatter of wheels on stone, all seemed too loud, too bright. I found myself flinching at sudden movements, my eyes drawn always to the edges of alleys, to the dark spaces between buildings. Our superiors received us in a cool, high-ceilinged room smelling of ink and dust. There was a British consular official, his hair thinning, his manner brisk, a Chinese provincial administrator in a neat grey suit, and 2 scholars from Wuhan, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. We gave our account. At first, we spoke cautiously, emphasizing the tracks, the physical signs, the disturbed camp. When we came to the sighting in the hollow, there was a pause. Henderson glanced at me, then at Zhang. "We saw a large primate," he said at last. "Unknown to science, bipedal, approximately 7 to 8 feet in height, covered in reddish hair." The British official's eyebrows rose. "A gorilla in Hubei," he said with a thin smile. "No," I said quietly. "Not a gorilla, something else." We described its appearance as best we could, each man contributing details, correcting one another. As we spoke, the room's atmosphere shifted subtly, from polite interest to a kind of strained patience. "And you have no specimen," one of the Wuhan scholars said. "No skull, no skin." "No," Henderson said, his jaw tightening. "We were in no position to attempt to kill." "Photographs, then?" the consular man asked. I produced the plates we had managed to keep dry, images of tracks in mud, of the clawed tree, of the nest in the hollow. There was one, taken in haste as the creature had turned away, that showed only a blurred, towering form between trunks, its outlines indistinct. To my eyes, knowing what it represented, it was damning. To others, it was a smudge. The officials examined them, murmuring. At length, the provincial administrator spoke. "There are many stories among the people of these mountains," he said, "of wild men, of spirits. It is possible that you encountered a large gibbon or some bear walking on its hind legs. In the fog, in fear, the mind can play tricks." "That is not what we saw," Llewellyn said, more sharply than was politic. The man inclined his head. "I do not say you are lying, Doctor, only that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Without a body, without clear photographs, it will be difficult to convince others." The matter of the missing muleteers was handled with a bureaucratic neatness that made my stomach turn. They were listed as lost in a landslide, presumed dead. Compensation was arranged for their families. There was no mention of Yeren in the official report. We were asked gently but firmly to keep our more speculative observations to ourselves, lest we inflame superstition or invite ridicule upon the institutions we represented. There was talk of a future, better equipped expedition, with more men, more weapons. It came to nothing. The world was moving towards other preoccupations. I returned to England that autumn, my notebooks and plates carefully packed among my clothes. On the voyage down river and across the seas, I tried to order my thoughts into a paper that would satisfy both truth and prudence. In the end, I produced 2 documents. The first was the official account, preliminary observations on the fauna and flora of the Shennongjia region, western Hubei. It spoke of tree species, of bird calls, of the tracks of bear and deer. It mentioned, in a brief, cautious paragraph, unidentified primate-like tracks and vocalizations, suggestive of a large, perhaps gibbon-like species hitherto unrecorded in the region, and called for further study. The second was for myself. In it, I set down everything. The smell in the hollow, the feel of the gaze upon me, the sound of Lee's song echoed from the fog. I described the face in as much detail as I could bear. I wrote of the missing men, of the crushed hat, of the mule's twisted neck. I did not know what to do with this document. To publish it as it stood would be to invite scorn, to risk my position, perhaps even my sanity in the eyes of others. So I locked it in a drawer. Life resumed its outward course. I obtained a lectureship at a small college, as I had wished. I taught young men about classification, about the slow, patient work of adding to the edifice of knowledge. I married, briefly. It did not last. The years passed. Wars came and went. The world's map shifted. Yet Shennongjia did not leave me. The first years were the worst. At night, I would wake with the sensation that something stood at the foot of my bed, watching. The room would be dark, the curtains stirring in a London draught, and for a moment the silhouette of the wardrobe would seem to bulk and shift, its top too high, its sides too broad. My heart would hammer, my mouth dry, until the edges resolved into ordinary furniture. Once, in the winter of 1939, during a blackout, I was walking home along a foggy street when someone began to whistle behind me. It was a simple tune, a nursery rhyme perhaps, but the notes were slightly off, flattened, the rhythm wrong. The sound of it in the damp, muffled air sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the war. I turned, half expecting to see a tall, shadowy form. It was only a man in a flat cap, his features obscured by the fog. He touched his hat in apology and passed. I stood for a long time afterwards, my back against a lamppost, breathing hard. In 1947, I received a letter from Li Jun. It came to my college, forwarded by some bureaucratic miracle from an old address in Yichang. The envelope was thin, the paper bearing the faint smell of smoke and tea. His English had grown more precise. He wrote that he had survived the years of war and occupation, that he now taught at a middle school in Wuhan. He had married, had children. He spoke briefly of scarcity, of rebuilding. Then, in a new paragraph, he wrote, "Sometimes when the fog comes down on the river, I think of those mountains. I tell my students there are many things we do not yet know. Some of them laugh, some listen. I have not been back to Shennongjia. I do not think I ever shall. But once, 3 years ago, a man came to the school from a village near those hills. He told me, quietly, that in the heavy snow of that winter they found tracks near their fields. Very large, very straight. He smiled when he saw that I believed him. We did not speak of it again." I wrote back, "Of course." We exchanged letters for some years, mostly about ordinary matters, teaching, the small absurdities of bureaucracy, the progress of our former students. We spoke only obliquely of Shennongjia. There was a shared understanding that to press too hard on that wound would be to open it anew. In my own country, I encountered from time to time reports that brushed against our experience. A paragraph in a journal about about Wildman sightings in the Caucasus. A brief note from an American colleague about tales of a Sasquatch in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. I read them with a peculiar double sensation: skepticism at their often sensational tone and a deep private recognition. I began, in quiet hours, to collect such accounts, clipping them from newspapers, copying passages from obscure books. They filled a folder in my desk. Patterns emerged: the great size, the hair-covered bodies, the human-like tracks, the uncanny vocalizations. Different names, different mountains, but a family resemblance. I told very few people of my own encounter. Once, in 1953, after a lecture at the Royal Geographical Society, a younger man approached me, eager, eyes bright. He had heard a rumor, he said, of an expedition in China that had seen something extraordinary. Would I care to comment? I looked at him, at his unlined face, his neat tie, his notebook ready. For a moment, I was tempted. Here, perhaps, was someone who might listen without laughter. But then I saw, over his shoulder, the portraits on the wall. Earnest men in frock coats, their names attached to mountains and rivers, their reputations built on certainty. I saw also the consular man's faint smile, the Wuhan scholar's cool appraising gaze. I am afraid there is little to tell, I said. We found some unusual tracks. The forest plays tricks on the imagination. He looked disappointed, then rallied, thanking me politely. I watched him go, feeling both relieved and ashamed. The years have thinned my hair, stiffened my joints, but they have not dulled certain memories. There are triggers that bring Shennongjia back with startling immediacy. A particular quality of light, for instance. On autumn afternoons, when the sun slants through the plane trees outside my window and catches the dust in the air, there is for a moment the same diffuse glow I saw in that Chinese fog when the world was reduced to trunks and breath. Or sound. Once, at a zoo, I heard a gibbon call, its long, rising whoop echoing off concrete. The hairs on my neck lifted before my mind had time to tell me that this was a caged known ape, its world bounded by iron. In 1962, I made one last attempt to rationalize, to fit what I had seen into some acceptable frame. A colleague of mine, an anthropologist, was giving a paper in Geneva on relic hominids. The possibility that small populations of archaic human forms might persist in remote regions. He spoke of Neanderthals, of Homo erectus, of the Denisova remains newly discussed. In the question period, someone mentioned the Yeti, the Sasquatch, the Yeren. The room tittered. I sat there, my hands clenched on my knees, feeling the old heat rise in my face. When the session ended, I approached the podium. My colleague greeted me warmly, assuming I had some technical query. "Do you think," I asked him, "that it is possible for a large, intelligent primate to persist unseen in a region like Western Hubei? Not entirely unseen, of course, but unacknowledged by science." He smiled indulgently. "There are always stories," he said. "But in this century, with our methods, our surveys, it would be very difficult for such a creature to remain undiscovered in any numbers. The occasional misidentified bear, perhaps, a hoax. But a breeding population of large apes in China? I should be very surprised." "So should I said quietly. "And yet," he clapped me on the shoulder, laughing, "you have been reading too many travelers' tales, my friend." I did not press the matter. What would have been the use? In the end, I have come to a kind of peace, though it is an uneasy one. I accept that there are things I have seen that I cannot prove. I accept that the world of journals and lectures and careful diagrams has no place for a tall red-brown figure standing in a Chinese hollow, looking at me with dark, measuring eyes. I accept too that the Yeren, if it still walks those forests, owes us nothing. Not its body for our museums, not its name for our Latin, not its story for our comfort. What haunts me most is not the face, though I see it often enough in the half-light between waking and sleep. It is a smaller detail, one that might seem trivial. In that basin, before we fled, I picked up, almost without thinking, a fragment of bark from the claw-marked tree. It was the size of my palm, the grooves running across it deep and parallel. I slipped it into my pocket. It travelled with me down the mountain, along the river, across the sea. For years it lay in a drawer, its sap hardened, its edges frayed. Sometimes, on difficult days, I would take it out and run my fingers along those grooves, feeling the ridges under my skin. It was a tactile proof that what I remembered had left some trace in the world beyond my own mind. One spring, I opened the drawer and found that the bark had crumbled. Time had dried it to brittleness, and some unnoticed jolt had reduced it to a handful of dark dust. I sat for a long time, looking at the empty space where it had lain. The mountains remain, of course. The forests of Shennongjia still stand, though their edges have been gnawed by roads and logging. Men go there now with better cameras, with tape recorders, with rifles that fire more than one shot. They bring back stories as we did. Some are printed, most are forgotten. On certain nights, when the city is quiet and the wind carries the faint smell of rain through the open window, I lie awake and think of those hills. I picture the fog pooling in the hollows, the branches shifting without wind, the cicadas falling silent as something moves between the trees. And in my mind's ear, from very far off, I hear again that low, rising call, like a question asked in a language we have chosen not to learn, echoing between the dark trunks, unanswered.